The text my sister-in-law sent me was 4 words long, and I read it 3 times before I understood what it meant. It's already been filed. I was standing in the parking lot of the Loblaws on Dundas, groceries in the trunk, engine running, and the world just stopped. Not dramatically the way they show it in movies. It stopped the way cold does when it gets inside your coat, quiet. Everywhere at once. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me later, when I thought about it. I'd always assumed that the moment your life unravels, your body would know before your brain did. But I just stood there, phone in hand, heat blasting through the vents, reading 4 words over and over like one of them might change. I didn't call her back. I called my lawyer instead. Hazel, I said when she picked up. They did it. A pause. Then, where are you right now? Parking lot, go home. Don't talk to anyone, I'll call you in 20 minutes. I drove home on autopilot. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table where my husband and I had eaten dinner the night before, where he'd passed me the salt without looking up from his phone, where everything had seemed so ordinary I hadn't even thought to question it. That was the thing about being betrayed by family. It doesn't happen in the dark. It happens in the light, over dinner, while someone's passing you the salt. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters, and because I spent a long time thinking I'd imagined it. My name is Adrienne. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Mississauga, studied accounting at McMaster, and for the past 4 years I've been running a small bookkeeping firm out of my home office. Nothing glamorous. 12 client files, mostly small businesses and sole proprietors, the kind of work where you know people's secrets better than their own accountants do. I liked it, I was good at it. I married my husband. I'll call him my husband, because even now that's easier than using his name 3 years ago. Small wedding, backyard ceremony, his mother crying into a tissue while his sister stood beside her with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. I remember noticing that smile. I filed it away and didn't think about it again for 2 years. His mother, I'll call her my mother-in-law. His sister, my sister-in-law. That's how I'll say it, because their names don't matter. What they did does. My mother-in-law is the kind of woman who makes everything feel like a test you didn't study for. She's from a family with money. Old Ontario money, the kind that comes with a cottage in Muskoka and opinions about which fork you use for the salad. And she never quite forgave my husband for marrying someone who grew up in a semi-detached on a street with a Tim Hortons on the corner. She was never cruel to my face. She was just particular. About how I loaded the dishwasher. About the wine I brought to dinners. About the fact that my firm wasn't incorporated. You should really speak to someone about that, she said once at Christmas, helping herself to more scalloped potatoes. The liability alone. I smiled. I told her I had it handled. I went back to my wine. The sister-in-law was different. She was the kind of mean that's smart enough to look like something else. She'd compliment you in a way that made you feel worse after. She'd ask about your work with exactly enough interest to remind you that hers paid more. She worked in commercial real estate downtown, had a condo on King West, drove a lease she talked about too much. She and my mother-in-law were close. The kind of close that made a room feel smaller when you walked into it. For 2 years I told myself it was just personality. Some families are like this. You marry the person, not the family. My husband was good to me, not perfect, but good. He'd roll his eyes when his mother said something pointed. He'd squeeze my hand under the table. I believed that counted for something. Then his grandmother died. My husband's grandmother had been the quiet center of that family. 84 years old, sharp as anything. She'd built a small portfolio over her lifetime. A rental property in Hamilton, some investments, a savings account that nobody talked about directly but everyone was aware of. When she passed in February, the grief was real, but so was the math. The will was straightforward. The Hamilton property would be sold and the proceeds split equally among her grandchildren. My husband had one sibling, his sister, so it was 50-50. Around $240,000 each after fees and taxes, give or take. My husband told me about it on a Sunday morning. We were sitting in bed with coffee, the kind of morning that feels like nothing can be wrong. He showed me the letter from the estate lawyer. I read it twice, handed it back, told him I was glad his grandmother had been so thoughtful. That should have been the end of it. 3 weeks later, my sister-in-law called him. I wasn't in the room, but I heard enough. The tone of his voice dropping, the long silences, the way he said I understand in that flat way that means the opposite. When he came back to the kitchen he looked like someone had let the air out of him. She thinks the split isn't fair, he said. I put down my spatula. What does that mean? Gran paid for her condo renovation last year. My sister's saying that should count toward her share. That Gran would have wanted the remaining estate divided to account for that. I stared at him. Is that in the will? No. Is there any document that says that? No. Then it isn't true. He looked at me the way he sometimes did when he didn't want to fight. She's grieving, Adrienne. She's not thinking straight. I let it go. That was my first mistake. Over the next 6 weeks, things shifted in ways I couldn't quite name at the time. My husband started taking calls in the other room. He got quiet in a way that wasn't sad exactly, more like careful. His mother invited him for dinner twice without including me, which hadn't happened before. When I asked about it, he said it was just family stuff, nothing I needed to worry about. I worried. I'm an accountant. I notice when numbers don't add up, and I notice when behavior doesn't add up. Something in my gut had started running the calculations and the results weren't good. One evening in late March, I came home from a client meeting and found my husband at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a legal pad covered in notes beside him. He closed the laptop when I walked in, not quickly, just decisively, the way you do when you don't want a conversation. Working late? I said. Just some stuff for the estate. I went to the fridge. I got out the leftover pasta. I did not ask what stuff. That night, after he was asleep, I sat in my home office and I did what I always do when something doesn't feel right. I started making a list. Things I knew for certain, things I suspected, things I needed to verify. The list was longer than I expected. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Hazel had done my business incorporation 2 years ago and had become something like a friend, the kind you only call when things are serious, but who picks up every time. I told her what I'd observed. Not conclusions, just facts. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Are you and your husband co-signatories on anything? She asked. Our joint account. And my business account has him listed as an emergency contact, not a signatory. Has anything moved in your accounts recently? I hadn't checked. I opened my banking app right there on the phone. Everything in the joint account looked normal. My business account looked. Hazel, I said slowly. What? There's a pre-authorized debit I don't recognize. It went out 10 days ago. $1,200 to who? I clicked through to the details. The payee was listed as a numbered company I didn't recognize. I don't know, I said. But I'm going to find out. It took me 4 days and a call to my bank's fraud department to trace it. The numbered company turned out to be a shell, recently registered in Ontario, director listed as an address in Etobicoke that turned out to be a UPS store. But the money trail connected to an account my sister-in-law had opened 6 months earlier. I sat with that information for a long time before I did anything with it. Then I started being careful. I moved my business account to a new institution my husband didn't know about. I downloaded and printed every bank statement I had for the past 2 years. I made copies of our joint mortgage documents, the title on our car, every piece of paper that touched anything we shared. I put everything in a file folder, and I put the file folder in a tote bag in the back of my office closet behind a box of old client files, and I did not tell anyone. Then I waited, and while I waited, I listened. It's strange, the things you hear when you stop talking. I heard my husband on the phone in the garage, voice low, saying, "She won't notice, and then we just need a few more weeks." I heard him tell his mother, over speaker in the car when he didn't know I was still in the back seat coming out of a rest stop on the 401, that Adrienne's not going to understand. I heard my sister-in-law at a family dinner I wasn't supposed to attend but ended up at because the date changed without anyone telling me, say that she's not really one of us anyway. I heard all of it. I wrote it down, date and time, in a notebook I kept in my car's glove compartment. The picture that emerged was this. My sister-in-law didn't want a 50-50 split, she wanted 3/4. Her argument, worked out with my mother-in-law and, eventually, my husband, was that the renovation Gran had paid for counted as an advance on her inheritance, which would have been fine if it were documented, which it was not. Since it wasn't, they'd decided to go another route. If my husband could be convinced to sign over a portion of his inheritance share into a family trust that my sister-in-law and mother-in-law controlled, the advance could be managed within the family. The problem was my name. Because my husband and I had mingled enough finances that any significant asset movement would require either my knowledge or my signature. And they knew I wouldn't sign anything. So the plan, as best I could piece it together, was to move money through my business account, small enough amounts to avoid immediate notice, until they'd siphoned enough to effectively rebalance the inheritance split without involving me at all. The $1,200 I'd caught was the first test, to see if I'd notice. I had noticed, I just hadn't let them know yet. Hazel was quiet for a long time when I laid it all out for her. "How solid is the documentation?" she asked. "The bank record is solid. The rest is circumstantial. My notes, what I overheard, the timing. That's more than most people walk in with." She paused. "Adrienne, before we do anything, how are you doing?" I looked out the window of her office. It was April by then, the kind of grey Ontario spring that can't quite commit. There was a cafe across the street where my husband and I had eaten brunch once, years ago, before any of this. "I'm okay," I said, and I mostly meant it. "I just want it to stop, okay?" She straightened her notepad. "Here's what we're going to do." What we did was file a fraud complaint with my bank, formally disputing the unauthorized transaction and flagging my account. Then Hazel sent a letter, not aggressive, very matter-of-fact, to the estate lawyer, noting that I was aware of discussions about redistributing inheritance assets, and that any such redistribution that involved my husband's share would require my written consent under our marriage contract. Because my husband and I had signed a marriage contract, it was something his mother had pushed for before the wedding, an irony I didn't miss, and it meant that any major financial decisions were shared ones. She'd pushed for that contract to protect her son from me. It ended up protecting me instead. The letter went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, my sister-in-law had sent that text. "It's already been filed." She meant the family trust paperwork, which they'd apparently tried to rush through before Hazel's letter could take effect. What she didn't know was that filing the paperwork wasn't the same as it being valid, and that Hazel had already been in contact with the estate lawyer, who was not pleased to learn that documents had been filed without all relevant parties being informed. The meeting happened on a Friday afternoon in a boardroom at Hazel's office downtown. Glass table, 8 chairs, a view of the financial district that felt almost absurd given the circumstances. My mother-in-law came in first, in a blazer I recognized from Christmas 2 years ago, face arranged into something that was trying to be dignified. My sister-in-law came in behind her, not looking at me. My husband came in last. He sat down across from me, and for a moment I thought he might say something. He didn't. The estate lawyer, a careful, patient man in his 60s, opened by laying out the problem with the trust filing, procedural issues, missing signatures, notification requirements under Ontario estate law that hadn't been met. He was very thorough. He was also clearly not happy to have been used as an instrument for something he hadn't been fully informed about. My sister-in-law interrupted twice. Hazel let her finish both times and then very calmly produced the bank records. "This is a transaction that was processed from my client's business account on March 14th, Hazel said, sliding copies across the table. "The payee is a numbered company incorporated 11 days prior. The director address is a mailbox store." She slid another document across. "This is the incorporation filing. We've also flagged this with the bank's fraud department, and I want to be transparent that there's a potential for a criminal referral here if we can't resolve this today." The room went very quiet. My mother-in-law looked at my sister-in-law. My sister-in-law looked at the table. My husband looked at me. And I looked back at him, and I didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the documents hadn't already said better. "We would prefer to resolve this as a family matter," Hazel continued, "and my client is open to that. But the terms need to be clear." The terms were these: the unauthorized transaction would be reversed and documented as such. The trust filing would be withdrawn. The inheritance split would proceed as written in the will, 50-50, and any future family financial arrangements would be conducted through proper legal channels, in writing, with all parties informed. If any further attempts were made to access my accounts or redirect my husband's assets without my knowledge, we would pursue it criminally. My sister-in-law's lawyer, she'd brought one, a younger man who looked like he hadn't expected the meeting to go this way, whispered something in her ear. She stared at the table, then she nodded. My mother-in-law said nothing. She just folded her hands in her lap very precisely, the way she did when she was trying to look like she wasn't angry. My husband signed the acknowledgement Hazel had prepared. He didn't look up from the paper. That night I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine and my dog, a scruffy terrier mix named after a hockey player, and I tried to figure out how I felt. The air smelled like wet grass and someone nearby cooking on a barbecue, and it was the most normal-smelling evening I'd had in 2 months. I was angry. Of course I was angry. Not the hot kind, the cold kind that sits in your chest and takes a long time to melt. I was angry at my sister-in-law for thinking I wouldn't notice. I was angry at my mother-in-law for laying the groundwork and letting her daughter take the risk. I was angry at my husband most of all, for sitting across tables from both of them while they planned something that would hurt me, and for believing, or choosing to believe, that it was justifiable. But I was also something else, something that took me longer to name. I was proud of myself, not in a loud way. Just quietly, privately proud that when the moment came, I hadn't panicked. I hadn't confronted anyone too early. I hadn't let them know I knew until I had everything I needed. I had sat with the discomfort and the uncertainty and the grief of it. Because it was grief, watching someone you love show you who they're capable of being. And I had been patient, and I had been prepared. My grandmother used to say that the most powerful thing a woman can do is know more than the room thinks she does. I used to find that a bit cynical. I understood it differently now. My husband and I went to counseling. I won't tell you how that went, because that's still being worked out, and it's the part of this story that belongs to me in a way the rest of it doesn't. I'll say that some things, once you see them, can't be unseen. I'll say that he told me he hadn't known about the business account. I'll say I'm still deciding whether I believe that and whether it matters. What I can tell you is this. A few weeks after the meeting, I got a call from an estate lawyer acquaintance my banker had referred me to. He was putting together a small financial literacy workshop, specifically for women navigating family estate disputes, and he'd heard about my case in the way that professional communities hear about things. Would I be willing to share my experience? I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 days and then I called him back and said yes, not because I'd forgiven anyone, not because I was over it, but because if there was even one other person out there reading a text message in a parking lot, not knowing that the documents she had were enough, that she was enough, then it seemed worth an uncomfortable hour talking to strangers about the worst 2 months of my life. I keep the file folder in my office now. Not hidden, just in my filing cabinet in a green hanging folder labeled Estate Matter Resolved. I don't think I'll need it again, but I like knowing it's there. Some people keep a journal. Some people keep a lawyer on speed dial. I keep my paperwork organized and I keep my eyes open. And I keep learning that in the end, the most dangerous thing you can be to someone who underestimates you is quietly, completely ready.